Hello, and welcome to Visits with Our Chatham Neighbors from Back in the Day. I'm Jeanne Eastman, President of the Chatham Historical Society, 2024. When our 5-year-old grandson visits us, our activities include stopping to see his ancestors at the Eastman Cemetery, hiking to old mines, noting old cellar holes and stone walls, and talking about old times. He has taken to referring to these times before he was born as back in the day. This book is a collection of stories from folks who lived in Chatham back in the day. I hope you'll enjoy meeting them through these short visits that tell about life in an earlier time. And these stories are read by Chatham neighbors of today. Enjoy.
This is David Crouse reading the dedication to Margery Eastman. Barbara McAllister Eastman grew up in Stowe, Maine, and went to the one-room schoolhouse at Stowe Corner. At that time, she didn't know many folks from Chatham. One day, the 4-H groups of Oxford County and Carroll County had a field day at Lester Evans' place in Stowe. Barbara noticed that there was only one boy who could back up a tractor and trailer. A few years later, Barbara rode the school bus to Fryeburg Academy, and so did that boy, whose name was Frank. After graduating, Barbara and Frank were married. They built their house in Chatham. Barbara began cooking hot lunches for the Chatham Center School in her kitchen. When the school closed and the Chatham students started going to school in Lovell, the Chatham Community Library moved into the schoolhouse. Barbara was the librarian and held contests to see who could read the most books. She also remembered what kinds of books everyone liked to read. Rodney Crouse liked westerns, and Don McPherson liked mysteries. Barbara organized a group of people to form the Chatham Historical Society. She collected and organized pieces of Chatham history and made newsletters to share the history with everyone. She also made many scrapbooks of interesting things printed in the newspapers and, with help, made a record of all the names on gravestones in the cemeteries. Barbara volunteered for Fryeburg Rescue, participating in active rescues, calling for volunteers, and serving as dispatcher. Barbara also served Chatham as a member of the school board, supervisor of the checklist, and town treasurer.
Yeah, my name is Jim Wilfong. Chatham is a small historic town located in northeastern Carroll County. 80% of the town is located in the White Mountain National Forest, with Evans Notch to the north, Mount Kearsarge to the south, Keyser Lake to the east, and the Bald Faces to the west. Colonial Governor Benning Wentworth granted Chatham's land to local leaders in 1767. The town was named in the honor of William Pitt, Earl of Chatham and Prime Minister of Great Britain. 3 buildings mark Chatham's historic town center. The Chatham Town Hall was built in 1833 by Captain Abraham Webb for $399. Over the years, it has been used for town meetings, elections, potluck suppers, and parties and events, historical society programs, and fundraisers. In 2018, an addition was built for the town office. Today, the selectmen and the planning board meet here. The Chatham Congregational Church was built in 1871 on land donated by Ithiel Clay. The 900-pound bell was cast by the Paul Revere Company of Boston and hauled to Chatham by 8 teams of oxen in the dead of winter. At one time, there was a rail outside the church where the horses were hitched. Besides Sunday services during warm months, there is the annual candlelight service at Christmas time. Weddings and funerals are still held at the church. The Chatham Center Schoolhouse was built in 1886 beside the town hall. In 1957, the schoolhouse was moved to its present location. Some favorite recess activities included playing in snowbank tunnels, sliding down the bank on a car hood, fishing in Langdon Brook, swinging from a swing that hung in a tall pine tree, and playing alley over. When the school closed in 1968, it was the last operating 1st to 8th grade one-room schoolhouses in New Hampshire. Then it became the home of the Chatham Community Library. In 1989, the Chatham Historical Society was established. It used the basement of the old schoolhouse to store its collection. In 2018, the library was discontinued and the Historical Society bought the building from the town. The town holds events like town picnics, bonfires, and talks and exhibits about Chatham history.
Hi, my name is George Perry, and I'm going to read some history about Thomas MacDonald, a first settler from 1773 to 1780. On July 2nd, 1772, Governor John Wentworth granted 1,829 acres to his private secretary, Thomas McDonough. McDonough cleared 12 acres by a brook near Chatham Center in 1773. At that time, the only other settlement in Chatham was beside the brook into Lower Kimball Pond, where Nathan Ames had a log house for his family and a saw and grist mill for the benefit of Freiburg. During the American Revolution, McDonough, who was loyal to the British government, left his land and fled to Canada. His land was confiscated, and other people settled on his grant. After the war, McDonough was sent as a British consul for the New England states. It was finally arranged that he could have his grant again by satisfying the people who now lived there. He did this by giving them the lots where they had settled. McDonough's smart young nephew, Hagan, managed his crew of Irishmen with much judgment. McDonough finally left Chatham and became rich in Boston. When Thomas McDonough last came to Chatham, he was in a 2-wheeled carriage and had an Irishman at each wheel to steady it over the logs and rocks in the path. This is about McDonough Brook. The McDonough Brook, named after Thomas McDonough, starts in Grace's Meadows behind Sloop Mountain. It runs along Butter Hill Road and eventually into Stowe, Maine, and the Little Cold River. In the 1800s, there were 3 mills in Stowe powered by this brook: a sawmill, a grist mill, and a shingle mill. Floods sometimes washed the mills away. In 1973, long after the mills ceased to operate, a flood control dam was built on McDonough Brook in Stowe in the effort to reduce flooding on the croplands of North Freiburg.
I'm Margery Eastman, and Solomon and Susanna Charles were my 4th great-grandparents, and Ann Augusta Whitaker's great-grandparents. So I am her second cousin 3 times removed. And this is a Memories of an Early Life in Chatham by Ann Augusta in the early 1800s. And she starts, I was born in 1859 on a farm at the foot of Baldface Mountain in Chatham, New Hampshire. My great-grandfather had settled there around 1800. How hard my ancestors labored. Just think of men going into the wilderness and cutting down trees with axes. The logs were taken to the yard with an yoke of oxen, sorry. Then with a broadaxe, they were hewn and fitted. When the logs were ready, the neighboring men were invited to help lift the logs to build a one-room house. They made the shingles for the roof from trees. The shingles were long, rough affairs. In those days, wild animals of several kinds were roaming the forest. Bears were used for meat. There were mountain lions, lynx, wildcats, and worst of all, wolves. A man would throw off his coat for the wolves to fight over while he made all possible speed for home. Still, they continued to struggle on. On one occasion, my grandmother's father went to the settlement for provisions. Her mother, like all others in those days, had to cook over the fireplace. When the supper was ready and her husband was not home, she left his supper by the fire to keep it warm, and she and the children went to bed with no door, just an old blanket to protect her hung at the door. She heard some animal come in, and it ate what was left on the hearth, and it went out. She thought it was a bear by the shuffling of its feet. Her husband got home safely, but just think of it. One of my relatives, Lucinda Brickett, went off alone on Blueberry Mountain. Well, there she killed a rattlesnake and fastened it to the bottom of her dress and took it home along with her 2 pails of berries. She wanted the snake for the oil, which was valuable. In those days, the men used oxen to tear up the sod so they could plant corn, bean, and wheat. They did not grow potatoes or other vegetables, but lived on corn, beans, wheat, and pork. They made their sugar from maple trees. Nearly everything they had was raised on the farm. Linen and clothing were made from woven cloth of flax and wool, and all sewn by hand with linen thread from flax. All socks were knit at home. Another job in the fall was drying apples, which were sold for 8 cents a pound. After apples were ready, my grandfather would load up and take his ox team and start for Portland, Maine, which was the nearest market, 50 miles off. He would bring home 10 gallons of molasses, 100 pounds of salt fish, and a few other groceries. Other men did not have a team of oxen that would take a bushel of corn or wheat and had to go 5 miles to get it ground at a mill, carrying it on their backs. Our family had many children and lived in a log cabin without furniture or dishes, just a big iron kettle and wooden spoons to eat with. Families like ours grew into strong, healthy men and women. My mother would make a kettle of what was called bean porridge, consisting of beans, corn, and pork. She would set the kettle on the floor, and we would sit around it and eat. We had no chairs, just blocks of wood. We used to take our clothes to the brook and wash them with a paddle made for the purpose. At age 11 years, I was living with my grandfather. He taught me to harness and drive a horse. When I was 12 years old, I would go into the pasture and get the horse while my grandmother would load the buggy with butter and eggs, and I would drive it 5 miles to the store and trade for things my grandmother wanted while the men worked in the field. In fall, my grandfather was sick, and he had some beans ready to harvest, and he was worrying because it was quite cold, and he expected the frost to kill them. So I thought to myself, I can pull them, but I know he wouldn't think I could not, and there was a half an acre of them. So I went out on my own accord and pulled every one. I saved the beans, and I knew he was glad, for I did not get a scolding. When I was 9 years old, I found I was an artist. Great-grandmother was sitting in her little red rocker, and when it was in a thoughtful mood, would sit with her finger on her nose. I caught the idea of making her picture. I got my pencil and paper and drew her picture. After I was drawing pictures of everything I could think of. One day, company came, and I drew a picture of the man's horse. And he saw it, and he said if I could make one for him, he would give me a new dress, and he did. And I was so proud of it, just to think that I had earned it myself. When I was 12, Grandfather let me raise 12 turkeys, which I sold. I took the money and bought material for a winter dress and coat. Then I went to a dressmaker who cut and made them, also a hat. When I got those on, I felt quite old. When I was 15, at home with my parents, Father worked away, and Mother and my sister could not do any work for all winter. I had 3 head of cattle to care for. I had to get water at the spring down a long hill, and I also had to get water for the horses at the same spring as the well being dry. We were a very happy and contented family.
This is Judy McGinty, and I'm reading about my great-grandfather's carding mill out in South Chatham. And I'll begin with in 1809. Captain Jonah Hill, with his bride Sally, came by horseback along the bridle path to the Kimball Pond in South Chatham. He built a log cabin on the hillside by the upper pond. In 1810, he built a carding mill on Mill Brook between the 2 ponds. Their oldest child, Jonah Jr., then built a frame house in 1831, and there the Hill family lived for several generations. Jonah Jr. and his son Dana, which is my great-grandfather, also worked at the carding mill until 1910 when it was closed. Farmers brought their wool to be washed and carded. I remember playing on the bags of wool before it was carded and sitting on the belt to be weighed by the steel yards. How badly I felt when I weighed more than the 50 pounds the steel yards would show. Under the mill was a big water wheel. The water rushing by it made in turn, which made all the gears of the mill machinery turn. I watched Grandpa put the wool through the picker. It came out all fluffed up, and he would shake a little oil on it. Next it went through a machine and over the roller until it was about an inch thick and a yard wide. Grandpa tore it off the roller in sheets and put it through the last machine. This sliced into the yard-long rolls about an inch in diameter. These rolls went back to the farm for the women to spin and then knit or weave into the cloth. The woven cloth was returned to the mill and put through the fulling machine to be made firm. Some of it was dyed before it was sent home again to be made into clothing. Beside the building was a brick arch with a huge iron kettle. It was used to wash the wool and dye the cloth. In the summertime, my grandmother washed the clothes there. Right after breakfast, every Monday morning, Grandpa would put the basket of soiled clothing on the wheelbarrow, wheel it to the mill. He filled the kettle with water from the brook and built a fire in the arch. By the time Grandmother got there, the water was hot. The white clothes were boiled in the kettle with soap that she had made. There was a longer poker stick forked on one end to swish the clothes around, lift them from the hot water. Then they were rinsed in a tub of cold water. Grandpa would then turn the hand wringer to squeeze the water from the clothing. Then he would wheel them home in the barrel, and Grandmother hung them on the lines out in the field to dry.
I'm George Andrews, and I'm going to read you the story of Frank Carlton. Otis and Dorcas Carlton moved to the very north end of Chatham in the 1840s, settling beside the brook that was then called Carlton Brook. Frank was the 4th child, born in 1863. As a boy, Frank was most likely had his chores to do, fill the wood box, so his mother could cook their meals, feed the calf, and carry hay to the cow in the winter, and swill to the pig. Then he was off with his friend Wally Guptill, who lived across the cold river. They explored the woods, fields, and streams, often coming home only as the day was ending. They probably fished in the string of beaver ponds in the meadow upstream from the Carlton home. Perhaps his father was at the meadow too, mowing meadow grass with his scythe and piling it to feed the animals during the long winters. Frank and Wally could hear the train whistle blow on the other side of Evans Notch and imagined going there one day to see the trains carrying logs and people to faraway places. When Frank was 10 years old, the wind blew the roof off their barn. By then, 2 of his sisters were married and little Martha had died. Frank helped with the farm, but he was forever terrified of the wind. He was 32 when both his parents died, leaving him alone on the farm with the howling wind that would sweep down from the mountain and rattle the windows of the house. When the wind blew the hardest, Frank headed for the nearby Andrews farm, where he sat up all night keeping the fires going. Frank never married, but lived alone, a hermit on his little farm. Years later, he traded his farm for the old schoolhouse on the Stonehouse Road. Millard Chandler, who lived just down the road at the Royce house, wrote in his diary on August 29, 1936, Harold Andrews and I worked all day at the Carlton place, tearing down barn and house to get material to put the floor in the hen house. Today, only the cellar hole and a few rusty pieces of an old car remain at the old farm site. The land became part of the White Mountain National Forest in the 1950s. A portable sawmill was set up in the Basin, back against the foot of the mountains, to saw railroad ties. In 1969, Basin Pond was dug out and the dam built to hold back water during the heavy rains. The campground was created, and today many people enjoy camping, fishing, and hiking at Basin Pond. Along the steep trail to the Basin Rim is Hermit Falls, named for Frank Carlton.
I'm Cynthia McAllister. I remember going to church, Florrie Hill, 1874 to 1882. I wasn't more than 11 or 12 years old when my grandfather, Jonah Hill Jr., began to take me with him to church. From that time on, when my grandfather went, I usually went too. Our church was in Chatham Center. Grandfather helped organize and build the church. The fact that it had a Paul Revere bell didn't mean much to me in those days, but to know that grandfather owned a pew was a different matter. We went over Robbins Hill. Grandfather always walked up the hill and drove the horse. I so enjoyed the ride, with the birds singing, the flowers and the ferns along the way, and the sun shining its way between the leaves of the trees that met overhead. Then, as we rode along over the ridge, Grandfather would tell me about the people who once lived here. On each side of the road, what had once been fields were now pastures for cattle. At one time, I noticed a little stone wall enclosure in one of these pastures. Grandfather said it was a pound in which to keep stray cattle until their owner claimed them. We rode for nearly a mile over the ridge, and then the hill descended abruptly, and we found ourselves close to the church. Horses were tied at the rail. The church bell was ringing, and we were just in time to enter the congregation. I can see myself now dressed in my Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, marching down the aisle ahead of my grandfather and entering our pew.
Hello, my name is Sheryl Emery, and I live in South Chatham. And I am the granddaughter of Amy Louise Hill Head. And the story that I'm reading this morning has a relative, possibly, in George Hill. I will begin reading. Topo, Pino, the Cooking School in South Chatham, adapted from the Boston Cooking School magazine, Volume 11, 1906 to 1907, by Mable M. Lutes, sketches by Solana Ward. When the train pulled up to the little station in Fryeburg, Maine, Mable felt glad that the warm, dusty ride from Boston was at an end. Several other young women alighted from other cars. Mr. George Hill took them on his horse-drawn, three-seated wagon with the mail to Mrs. Hill's cooking school at Topo, Pino, in South Chatham, where they would learn to cook wonderful things. In one lesson, Mabel helped prepare dishes for a picnic. The horses and wagons carried them all to a beautiful spot. The ferns made ideal table decorations, and the spiders and ants that tumbled into the cups of coffee only added spice to the delicious repast. Another day, the class gave a reception for friends and neighbors. The house was transformed into a veritable fairyland. The 7 cooks were flying around making ice creams and cakes that would make a caterer green with envy. On the final day, the women decided to have one more frolic up Hurricane Mountain. The big wagon and horses carried them to the start of the trail. The ascent was steep and hard for the horses, so only 2 could ride at a time. At the top, they all enjoyed the view of the villages to the west, while in the background towered the presidential range of the White Mountains. They tarried as long as they dared, while the sun sank lower in the west. They were surprised when they turned homeward to find that their driver had tied a veritable Christmas tree to the back of the wagon, but instead of being able to spread its branches proudly, it was forced to be dragged ignominiously along the ground. Looks of wonder and exclamations of surprise brought forth the explanation. The wagon was heavy and the descent so steep that, notwithstanding the brakes, it was very hard on the horses. The dragging tree would help break the wagon. The horses, wagon, driver, and young ladies had not gone far when one venturesome pedagogue decided that, if a little weight was good, more would be better. Whereupon she added her body to the brake by standing on the prostrate tree. Soon another sprang on behind her, and still another, until amid shrieks of laughter, the tree added little ripples of mirth as it slid along over the rocky road. And the horses even whispered together in their glee. The descent, instead of being tiresome, was filled with unexpected pleasures, and when they reached their homes at dusk, all agreed that this day was only one of many happy ones spent in South Chatham.
Mr. Bull the steer. Mr. Bull the steer, with a ring in his nose, joined the 2 dry cows and 3 heifers for the May drive from Stowe Corner up the valley. Driving several cattle along a country road was not an easy job. They venture into gaps in stone walls and into dooryards and gardens if they can. My brother Ben or I ran ahead of them every time we neared a house to protect the owner's lawn and vegetables from our animals. We reached the Royce barnyard by 11 o'clock. There we rested for half an hour and ate sandwiches of ham and eggs Mom had put up. Then we turned our now less frisky cattle into the Royce pasture and guided them up the rocky logging road to our much higher pasture. Once a week for the rest of the summer, Dad would harness Jerry to the wagon and drive up to the Royce place, usually accompanied by one or more of us kids, and walk up to the pasture with a quart of rock salt in a wooden measure. He would bang on the gate with a stick and call, "So, boss, so, boss." The cattle would come thundering down the grassy slope with bobbing heads and flying tails to the salting place. There they would crunch eagerly on the granules of salt we dropped by handfuls into several salting spots, soon clear of grass killed by the salt. We would talk to them and rub the heads and backs of those tame enough to let us. One Sunday in July, Sim, Ben, and I all went with Dad to the mountain pasture. We weren't allowed to fish on the Sabbath, and we had nothing better to do on that warm, sunny day. When we reached the pasture, Dad banged on the wooden gate as usual and called to the cattle. Soon the 2 cows and the 3 heifers pranced down to where we waited by the salt drops. "Hey, where's Mr. Bull the steer?" I wondered aloud. Soon our steer appeared from behind some gray birch bushes. He walked halfway down and then stopped and stared at us. We all stared back at him. Something was wrong with Mr. Bull, very wrong. His nose looked like a big pincushion. Dad groaned aloud. "Oh no, hedgehog quills." Our steer came closer, walking a bit unsteadily. The hollows in front of his hip bones were deeper than I'd ever seen them, indicating that he hadn't eaten for a day or 2. "Oh boy, is he hurting," Sim observed. "Let's catch him," I said. "We can surround him and grab his ring." But Mr. Bull was smart, sensing what the boys were up to. He loped easily between Dad and Ben and again took up stand by the spruce tree. "It's no use," Sim cussed. "Oh, I'll catch him myself," I blurted. "He trusts me. After all, Mr. Bull and I did have a sort of rapport." "Yeah, go ahead and catch him," Ben dared me. I moved slowly toward Mr. Bull, speaking his name softly over and over, holding a red apple out so he could see it. His ears perked up, and he held his head higher. I took a bite of the apple so Mr. Bull could smell it. His tongue flicked out and back. I inched toward him, and he opened his mouth. I started my final move to give him the fruit and slipped my index finger up inside his ring. Then, at the crucial moment, the apple touched one of the quills in Mr. Bull's upper lip. That was enough. He swung away from me and gave his head a toss. And a minor miracle happened. The ring flipped up and right over the end of one of the dead branches of the tree beside him. No trees have stiffer or stronger dead branches than a spruce. Mr. Bull was now standing quite still, held by the limb thrust inside his ring. "Well, now this is swell," I crowed happily as I stepped up and seized the ring. "Come on, boy." I led him down to the others. "Of all the dumb luck," Sim exclaimed. Dad gave me a slap on the back, and his hand joined mine on the ring. "Good work, sonny." I felt like the king of the hill. Dad didn't hand out praise often. We led our steer down to the Royce place without incident. Dad put Jerry's halter on Mr. Bull and tied the halter rope tightly to the rear axle of our wagon. Minutes later, we were heading south for Stowe Corner. A mile down the road by the Childs farm, we met a lean, whiskered man driving a horse and buggy. "It's Ernie Andrews, the trapper," Sim observed. "I bet he'll want to stop and talk. He always does." Sim was right. Ernie Andrews stopped his horse and held up a hand to halt Dad as we drew about even with his buggy. Dad reined Jerry up and said, "Hello, Ernie. How's things with you?" Ernie said, "Fine, Will." Then he reached down behind the buggy's dasher. "I bet you ain't never seen one of these varmints." He held up the darndest thing I'd ever seen. It was the hide or pelt of a big cat, at least 4 feet long. The 4 of us stared in breathless awe at the strange thing. Then, with no warning, we were all thrown violently forward. My face hit the back of the front seat. Dad and Sim were almost pitched out. "He's getting away! He's loose!" Ernie yelled. In the moment of pain and confusion, I pictured Ernie's savage creature leaping toward us with slashing claws and snarling jaws. The screech of tortured wire being pulled hard against other metal shocked our ears. Ernie's voice came again. "He went right through. He's with the others." The 4 of us in the wagon began to realize what had happened. Mr. Bull was no longer hitched to the rear axle. He was in the child's pasture, mingling happy with the cows. "Gosh, I'm sorry, Will," Ernie apologized. "I had no idea he'd do that if I showed you this pelt." "What the heck is that darn thing?" Sim asked. "It's a Canada lynx," Ernie exclaimed. "I got him up on Mount Eastman." Mr. Bull had taken one good look when Ernie held up the lynx pelt and thrown himself backward, snapping the halter rope. Ernie apologized again, clucked to his old horse, and moved on. Dad hitched Jerry to a fence stake. "What rotten luck. We've got to catch him again, and we can't expect a miracle this time." The stocky owner of the farm was coming toward us through the pasture. Dad spoke. "Hello, Fred. We just added a steer to your herd." Fred chuckled. "I bet he met a quill pig up in your high pasture." Dad told the story. Fred wiped the sweat from his red face. "Why don't we drive my cows and him into my tie-up? We'll hitch him in a stall, and I have a pair of pincers you can use on those quills." It was an easy matter. 10 minutes later, Dad was pulling out the quills. Ben counted the quills as Dad dropped them on the floor, but lost count in the 60s. At last all the wicked little needles were out. Mr. Bull the steer shook his head again and again and licked his nose with a long, writhing tongue. "He looks hollow and hungry," Fred observed. "Why don't you leave him here for a day?" Dad said that would be great. The next afternoon we rode up the valley, stopping at Fred's to pick up our steer. We led him up to our high pasture. He was looking more normal and even pranced a bit as he rejoined his bovine companions.
A Farm Boy, adapted from memories of Alfred Hanscom. In 1936, when I was 10 years old, we moved to Chatham, my father's, grandfather's, and great-grandfather's birthplace. Suddenly, I found myself in a sprawling, colonial-era red-brick farmhouse with a large barn and acres of land. Not for a minute did I miss my life in the city. We had several cats, which lived in the shed and barn and were real assets. Our field corn crib would be full by autumn with long ears of full corn to be fed to the cattle. Around that, of course, the rats and mice would multiply. Never did we buy cat food for our cats. The multitude of rats around the corn crib was an ample food supply. When the female cats had litters up to 6 to 12 kittens, these would grow up and fan out to surrounding farms, sometimes giving us 20 to 30 cats at one time. The summer of 37, when I was 11 years old, I raised 3,000 cockerels, marketable at age 3 months. I should have made a reasonable profit, but the cost of grain was so high and the market value of the broilers so low that at the end of the summer, I barely paid expenses, with nothing to show as a profit. This, despite the fact that I had worked hard all summer long. That same summer, I tried my hand at raising a small flock of turkeys, perhaps 20 of them. When they were half grown, one summer day, a huge thunderstorm hit, causing panic among the turkeys. They crowded into their shelter into a big heap and managed to smother each other. Not one of them survived. Nellie, our horse, was a patient laborer. I would ride on her back to cultivate the garden and crops. She would pull the hay wagon up the incline from the interval fields beside the cold river. Laddie, our white collie, was our family dog throughout my teenage years. When we would go to work down the rutted interval road, he would run alongside us. Sometimes Laddie would round up the cows at day's end for their trip from the pasture to the barn for milking. Every Saturday afternoon, I would be climbing up the mountain trails. One day, I got too ambitious and decided to climb Mount Chandler, 4 ranges over from Baldface. I didn't tell my parents about heading that direction. On top of Mount Chandler, the trail disappeared and it was quickly getting dark. Wearing only a white shirt in September, I started getting quite cold. So I decided to hunker down for the night and find my way in the morning. Come morning, I adopted the strategy of going to the left to the highest point, hoping I was heading in the right direction. Finally, I stood on Old Sloop Mountain overlooking Chatham Valley, and all I had to do was descend. I found my way home, arriving by 11 a.m. All was pandemonium. The AMC Club, White Mountain Rangers, my father, and all of our neighbors have been looking for me all night. I was rested and in better shape than most of them. I made it a promise never to try that again. My life was shaped by being a farm kid in Chatham. Perhaps some of the most honest and trustworthy people I have ever encountered were those people in that remote valley. Many of them didn't talk a lot, and they certainly didn't have much to say to a young boy. But you knew if you were ever in trouble, they would drop what they were doing and give you help.
Summer days at the Royce House Inn. The car had barely stopped when Peter and Ann jumped out, looking around to see if everything at the Royce house was just the same as when they'd left at the end of last summer. The cows in the pasture, the mountains surrounding the big house, and the enormous barn. They ran to the big barn looking for their favorite cats, which they knew from experience were hiding in the haymow or sunning themselves on a windowsill. During the days, Peter and Ann and their parents went off for hikes up Baldface Mountain to pick blueberries, or to any one of the surrounding hills and mountains for picnics and adventure. They swam in Emerald Pool and fished in Cold River. Sometimes the older folks sat in the rocking chairs on the shady porch and talked and enjoyed the view and fresh air. Etta Chandler, along with her son Millard and his wife Anna, ran the farm and inn. They tended a large garden. Millard milked the cows and raised pigs and chickens. Nodheads and other old varieties of apples grew on the apple trees around the farm. Anna and Etta baked bread and pies and cakes on the double wood-burning stove in the kitchen. Pete and Ann looked forward to each magnificent meal that they were served. Sometimes Pete happened to be around the barn while Millard was milking the cows. How interesting to watch the streams of milk hit the bucket with a great thud and then splash and foam as the pail filled. The cats came running when they heard the splashes, and sometimes Millard aimed the stream of milk right into a waiting cat's mouth. Then Millard cranked the handle on the cream separator, and cream flowed out one spout and skim milk from the other. Anna and Etta made the cream into butter and sometimes ice cream. They made skim milk into cottage cheese, and always some milk was left for the cats. Some summer evenings, Millard invited Peter to see his collection of gems he had found nearby. There was topaz from Baldface Mountain and big chunks of crystal amethyst from Deer Hill. Pete touched each piece as he listened to Millard's stories of walking the nearby hills and finding the beautiful gems. Peter wanted to find beautiful gems too, and one day in the future, he would. When he grew up, he became a geologist and eventually had his own collection of beautiful rocks and minerals and gems from the mountains and hills surrounding the Cold River Valley. He displayed his collection in a little museum he called the Rock Room in the Chatham house that his parents eventually bought and one day became his, and now belongs to his children and grandchildren. They still enjoy gazing at this special collection and remembering Peter and Ann's summer visits to the Royce house and their time with the people who lived there and all the old ways of the valley.
This is Steve Eastman talking about my school vacations at Chandler Farm in Chatham. By the time I was old enough to spend my school vacations from school in Freiburg at Chandler Farm with Aunt Fanny and Uncle Nod, they had stopped operating an inn for guests, but they still had 20 cows that they milked every day. My job at chore time was to shovel the manure out of the gutter behind the cows. That was a job Uncle Nod thought I could handle. During my winter vacations, I went with Uncle Nod to the woods where he was cutting trees for firewood and for saw logs to sell. My job in the woods was to shovel the snow away from the base of the trees so he could cut them very low, not wasting a bit of the tree. In the summer, sometimes Auntie would pack us a lunch, and Uncle Nod and I would climb Baldface Mountain to pick blueberries. We had a great view back to the farm. Before we left, we synchronized our watches with Auntie's clock in the kitchen, and at the agreed-upon time, usually noon, Uncle Nod took a mirror out of his pack and made the sun flash off it down to Auntie, who was standing in the field behind the farmhouse with her mirror flashing the sun to us. So we knew Auntie was fine, and she knew we were fine too. On winter evenings, Uncle Nod built a fire in the fireplace, Auntie popped popcorn, and we played cribbage. Farm life seemed so perfect, with Uncle Nod and Auntie working as a team every day. The hat I always wore in the cow barn gradually took on the smell of the barn. When my week-long visit ended and I returned home, I kept my barn hat on my bedpost so I could smell it before going to bed and be reminded of my happy time on the farm. My mother offered to wash the cap for me, but I wouldn't let her. I had wished I could be a farmer when I grew up, and one day my dream came true. I now live in the brick house in Chatham that my great-grandfather, Jacob Eastman, built in 1854, and my wife Jeanne and I work on our small family farm.
I'm Frank Eastman. I was born on the Butter Hill Road, 1935. People ask me now if I've lived in Chatham all my life, and I tell them not yet. When I was a kid, my father wanted to have a boat that he could use fishing up Mountain Pond. So he went in the blacksmith shop, got his lumber, built a flat-bottom rowboat. It was then the idea, or the problem was to transport it from home to the pond, 2 miles up the side of the mountain. My brothers loaded the boat onto a scoop with a team of oxen, and they started up Mountain Pond. They'd stop and rest the oxen when they needed to and went along with it. And when they finally got to the pond, they unloaded the boat and carried it down to the water and left the oxen hooked to the scoop, standing there alone. The kids, being kids, they went out and they was having fun out on the water in the rowboat, and they looked back and the oxen was out in the pond with the boat, with the scoop hooked on behind them, swimming. They thought that wasn't a good idea, and they didn't think Father would appreciate it, so they got back. Norman got the cord stick off of the yoke, which laid across the team's necks, and he coaxed them to turn and coaxed them back to where they'd get the feet on the ground. They weren't swimming anymore, so they got them ashore. It was a while before Father found out about the oxen swimming, but he did know that he got his boat up there all right. So that's about the end of that. Lauren Andrews was married to my wife's grade school teacher in Stowe, Maine. And he loved kids. He didn't have any children of his own. So every year he'd take the students that were suitable to hike to Mountain Pond, not the first and second graders maybe, but the older students. And he'd go in and stay either in the shelter or the cabin in Mountain Pond over the weekend. And then he'd bring them back to the parents at the end of the weekend. When they was building the ditch to drain the water into McDonough Brook, they was drilling the rocks to blast them with dynamite or with black powder. And the decision was made to stop. One of the stones that was in the trail, they had started to drill down into it. And when the decision was made to stop, the hole wasn't very deep. Lauren spotted that. It was a good-sized rock. And when he would take the kids into Mountain Pond, he would stop at that rock and get the kids all around him and say, "You see this dent in the stone?" The kids would say, "Yeah, what made it?" And Lauren would say that the teamsters driving their teams in here when they were logging and getting hay off of Gracie's meadow would stop at that rock and stand the good stick on end. And they came up here times enough, so just the sticks wore that dent into the rock. Of course, he was telling stories, and he was a real good storyteller. It amused the kids. But I remember hearing Lauren say one day, I had the kids sit around the campfire, and I was telling them stories. But he said they didn't realize I was counting noses. I wanted to make sure every kid that went in came back, and he said they all did. So he was successful in that, and he amused the kids, which it was very easy for him to do.
I'm June Kelly, and I am about to read you a poem that I wrote in June of 2004 called Biking Round the Square. There's nothing quite so wonderful as biking round the square, and nothing quite so carefree as wind beneath my hair. A bologna in my basket between a slice of bread, and one more for my brother, peanut butter instead. The boys are in the front, leaders of the pack. My friend and I are following a little farther back. The sun is peeking over the trees and wildflowers nodding in the breeze. We cross from one state to another. To me it looks the same, but I know we're in another state, for the road sign tells the name. We passed a white country church that sits across the center. Its granite steps lay welcoming all loyal souls to enter. We continue on our journey to the cemetery on the hill to visit loved ones gone to rest. They're forever remembered still. We coast along the meadow, cows grazing on the grass, and on the opposite side of the road is our grandparents' farm at last. Grammy's large rock garden, not a prettier sight to see. Tall elm trees in a row beckoning past by me. Grandpa near the barn door with a milking pail in hand. Grammy on the front porch, waving to beat the band. Fresh lemonade in a pitcher, cooling on some ice. Cookies baked that morning. Oh, they taste so nice. With our bellies full and our thirst refreshed, we wave goodbye and comment, wasn't it the best? We stop a while to visit our cousins on their farm. They throw a hen out in the pond. I hope they do no harm. We turn right at the sharp corner and head on down the lane. We've crossed the state line again, and now we're back in Maine. We pedal through the forest and cruise by the old sand pit. Our bodies are getting hungry and wanting time to sit. We stop at a friend's house to visit and eat. Our friend's mom is waiting with a special treat. We couldn't end our adventure without stopping at the store to cash in our bottles. We found no more than 4. But it buys us all some bubble gum and Boston beans to share. We say goodbye to all and head home without a single care. Oh, what I wouldn't give again to be Vic there, jumping on my bicycle and riding round the square.
This is Margery Crouse, and I'm reading my cousin's poem, Across the Line, Chatham Camping. My heart tells me Maine is better than the rest, but camping across the line is a close second best. Our camper is nestled at the edge of the forest deep, where crickets and whippoorwills sing us to sleep. Sparkling stars light up the sky, like thousands of diamonds floating by. In the distance, a wolf howls to the moon, as our garbage can is invaded by a wild raccoon. The sun, rising up after an early morning rain, sees a moose and her baby meandering up the lane. Is my heart confused? Is Maine really the best? Maybe across the line is better than the rest.
This is Matt Pittman telling a story on my Uncle Merle's farm by Dick Hill. My uncle and my grandfather, Merle, is the story. I was living with Uncle Merle and Aunt Edna Pittman in South Chatham during my grammar school days. I had been helping Uncle Merle pick up rocks from his cornfield. We tossed the rocks into the dump cart. Uncle Merle hooked Ned, the horse, to the dump cart and took off down Green Street to dump the rocks in a boggy spot in the Dewing Meadow. There was a closed gate just before the house and barn at the Dewing place. Something spooked old Ned after crossing the bridge over Meadow Brook, and the horse took off. As they were approaching the closed gate, Uncle Merle thought Ned was not going to stop, so he jumped off, breaking his leg. Lauren Andrews came down from North Chatham to do the chores while Uncle Merle recuperated. One hot Sunday morning, I also helped with the morning chores, hoeing the gutters accumulation down the scuttles behind the cows, washing the cows' udders, doing the milking, and turning the cows out to pasture. By then, Aunt Edna had breakfast ready. Then, while waiting for the hay to dry, Uncle Merle, Aunt Edna, and Lauren were sitting in rocking chairs on the front porch. Lauren was telling stories, Aunt Edna was knitting, and Uncle Merle was whittling. I was entranced while listening to Lauren's stories. All of a sudden, a little green grass snake appeared from under the lilac bush. The snake was about a foot long and had a lump in his middle. Lauren said, "Quick, Dickie, bring me that short dead limb over there." Lauren stood up, gently stepped on the snake's tail, and rubbed the stick from the snake's tail towards his mouth. A little toad hopped out. Then Lauren walked across the driveway beyond the little stream running down from the ice pond to where we had transplanted the purple raspberries. Lauren returned with a big green raspberry leaf in his hand. On the leaf were 4 white speckled eggs. The eggs were about the size of jelly beans, perhaps a tad smaller. Lauren cracked open the eggs one at a time. A tiny little snake emerged from each egg.
Alan Eastman of Chatham. After Thanksgiving, I'd go up with my Uncle Ramey and my Aunt Kelly and my cousin Andy up to the Rollins pasture where my great-great-grandmother, Eliza Rollins Eastman, had grown up. We were gathering fir boughs to make Christmas wreaths. My Aunt Kelly showed Andy and me the pointy deer tracks and the round rabbit tracks in the snow. Sometimes we saw very big tracks that were made by moose, and there were lots of little tiny tracks made by squirrels and mice. While Aunt Kelly and Uncle Ramey decided which tall fir tree to cut, Andy and I ran along the rabbit tracks with our homemade bows and arrows. We never got a rabbit. We never even saw one, but there were sure lots of tracks. After Uncle Ramey had cut down the tree, I tried out Grandpa Eastman's sharp axe to chop the branches off. Uncle Ramey had shown me how to hold the axe so I wouldn't cut my leg. Top of the tree was saved for a perfect Christmas tree. After we had loaded the pickup truck with the fir branches and tree, Andy and I gathered some dead branches and Uncle Ramey lit a fire. We got warm and toasted hot dogs over the flames. Then we'd stop to see the rocky cellar hole where the house had been 100 years ago. There was a view to the hills far, far away, and under the nearby apple trees there were lots more deer tracks. By then the sun was setting over the mountain. Andy and I buried ourselves deep underneath the boughs in the back of the pickup to keep warm on the ride home. It smelled like Christmas the whole bumpy way.